Picture this. You meet someone who feels calm at first, independent, steady, hard to read, maybe, but strangely magnetic. They are not dramatic, not overly emotional, not constantly asking for reassurance. In fact, part of what pulls you toward them is that they seem so self-contained, like they know exactly who they are, exactly what they want, exactly how to move through life without needing much from anyone. And at first, it feels refreshing, maybe even safe. The connection grows. Slowly, quietly, you begin sharing more. They begin opening in small ways. A longer conversation, a deeper question, a moment of vulnerability you almost miss because it arrives so briefly. And for a while, it feels like something real is unfolding. But then something shifts. Right when the closeness starts becoming meaningful, they pull back. Their energy changes. The warmth that once felt natural suddenly feels inconsistent. The messages slow down. The affection becomes harder to reach. You begin wondering whether you imagine the whole thing, whether they care less than you thought, whether somehow, without realizing it, you became too much. And this is where so many people misunderstand avoidance. Because from the outside, their distance can look like indifference. Their silence can feel like rejection. Their withdrawal can seem almost cold. But what if the distance is not always about lack of feeling? What if sometimes the exact opposite is happening? Because here is the truth few people talk about. For many avoidants, love does not begin with safety. It begins with activation. The moment a connection starts becoming emotionally important, something deeper begins waking up beneath the surface. Not just attraction, not just affection, fear, old fear, the kind of fear they rarely speak about because most of it was learned before they even had language for it. And if you do not understand this, you will misread almost everything. You will think the story is ending, when in many cases, the deeper story is only beginning. Because avoidants often want closeness. That part surprises people. They want connection, partnership, love, safety, someone who understands them, someone who stays. But wanting closeness and knowing how to receive it are two very different things. And this is where the confusion begins. Because for many avoidants, love does not simply feel comforting. It also feels dangerous. Not dangerous because of you. Dangerous because of what closeness starts stirring inside them. You have to understand something important about the dismissive avoidant nervous system. Most avoidants did not become avoidant because they hated connection. They became avoidant because somewhere early in life, connection stopped feeling emotionally safe. Maybe emotional needs were ignored. Maybe vulnerability was dismissed. Maybe closeness came with criticism, control, inconsistency, pressure, or emotional absence. And as children, we do not interpret those experiences by saying, "My caregivers probably struggled emotionally." No, children personalize pain. They internalize it. They quietly learn, "I should not need too much. I should handle things alone." Depending on people is risky. Closeness disappoints. Needing others creates pain. And over time, independence becomes survival. Distance becomes regulation. Self-sufficiency becomes identity. So by adulthood, many avoidants have become incredibly good at functioning. They look capable, stable, strong, even emotionally unaffected. But underneath that independence is often something far more vulnerable. A nervous system still trying to protect itself from emotional overwhelm. And that changes everything about how love feels to them. Because when an avoidant meets someone meaningful, something paradoxical begins happening. Part of them feels relief. Finally, someone who feels safe, someone calming, someone emotionally grounding, someone who sees them without demanding they become someone else. But another part of them becomes alarmed because closeness starts creating emotional exposure. And emotional exposure feels unfamiliar, unpredictable, risky. The more emotionally important you become, the more vulnerable they become. And vulnerability is often where the inner conflict begins. This is why loving an avoidant can feel confusing, because what feels like intimacy to you may simultaneously feel comforting and overwhelming to them. You feel the connection growing. They feel it too. But while one part of them moves toward closeness, another part instinctively starts protecting against it. And suddenly the person who seemed warm becomes harder to reach. Not necessarily because the love disappeared, but because fear arrived alongside it. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings in avoidant relationships. People often assume if they cared, they would not pull away. But avoidants often pull away because they care. Because caring raises the emotional stakes. Because now there is something to lose. Now there is emotional dependency forming. Now there is vulnerability. Now there is the terrifying possibility of disappointment, rejection, loss, or losing themselves inside closeness. And if someone learned early that relying on others was unsafe, love can start feeling emotionally expensive, even when they desperately want it. This is why avoidants often look contradictory. One moment they are close, present, connected, then suddenly distant, quiet, hard to read. And if you take this personally, which many people naturally do, you begin reacting from fear. You chase clarity. You seek reassurance. You ask what changed. You try harder, love harder, explain more, fix more. Because from your perspective, the connection feels like it is slipping away. But here is where something painful often happens. The more pressure an avoidant feels during moments of emotional overwhelm, the more their nervous system starts associating closeness with loss of freedom. Not because love itself feels bad, but because emotional pressure feels overwhelming. And suddenly, both people are hurting. One person fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. One moves closer, the other pulls back. And without understanding what is happening underneath, the relationship slowly becomes a cycle of misunderstanding. But stay with me, because this is where most conversations about avoidance completely fail. People often stop at they need space, they fear intimacy, they are emotionally unavailable. And while there is truth inside those ideas, it misses something far deeper. Avoidants are not only protecting distance, they are protecting themselves from emotional experiences they never learned how to regulate safely. And once you understand that, the relationship starts looking very different. Because underneath the distance, there are often emotional needs most people never recognize, needs they rarely know how to ask for, needs that, when misunderstood, quietly destroy connection. And the strange thing is, the very things avoidants need most in love are often the exact things relationships stop giving them once conflict begins. That is where the real story starts. What most people misunderstand about avoidance is this. They often look like people who need less closeness, less reassurance, less emotional intensity, less conversation, less dependency. And because of that, many partners assume the answer is to simply back away, to stop asking, stop needing, stop expecting, almost as if the relationship can only survive if you become smaller, quieter, less emotional, less human. But that is not actually what healthy love with an avoidant requires. Because beneath the distance, avoidants usually do not need less. They need something different. And if you miss this distinction, you can spend years loving someone while accidentally speaking an emotional language they do not know how to receive. This is where the story becomes deeper, because when avoidants feel emotionally safe, something shifts, slowly, quietly, but powerfully. The walls soften, the withdrawal becomes less sharp, the nervous system starts settling. And perhaps the biggest misunderstanding of all is this: avoidants are not usually searching for perfection. They are searching for emotional environments that do not overwhelm their survival system. That difference matters a lot, because for many avoidants, healthy love does not begin with intensity. It begins with safety. And one of the first ways safety appears for them is through something many people overlook completely: understanding, not agreement, not control, understanding. This matters more than most people realize, because many avoidants spent years feeling emotionally misunderstood. As children, their inner world often had nowhere safe to land. Big emotions may have been dismissed, needs may have been minimized, emotional vulnerability may have felt inconvenient to caregivers who were unavailable themselves. And eventually, many avoidants adapted by learning one painful lesson: do not expect people to emotionally understand you. So they stopped explaining, stopped asking, stopped relying, stopped expecting emotional rescue. And over time, self-sufficiency became protection. This is why support feels so important to avoidants, although support may not look the way most people imagine. Because for an avoidant, support often feels like being emotionally respected, emotionally understood, emotionally trusted. It sounds simple, but psychologically, it changes everything. Sometimes support looks like this: they need time alone, and instead of interpreting it as rejection, you understand it as regulation. Not permanent distance, not abandonment, regulation. That distinction matters. Sometimes support looks like respecting silence without turning silence into punishment. Sometimes support looks like asking questions without interrogation, showing curiosity without emotional pressure. Sometimes support looks like quietly communicating: I care about you, and I am not trying to control you. Because for many avoidants, control feels deeply threatening, not always consciously, but emotionally. Their nervous system often associates emotional closeness with losing autonomy, losing freedom, losing themselves. This is one of the biggest hidden fears in avoidant attachment. And if you have ever loved someone avoidant, you have probably felt confused by this. Because from your perspective, wanting closeness feels normal, wanting reassurance feels loving, wanting consistency feels healthy. And often, it is. But to an avoidant nervous system, too much emotional intensity too quickly can feel overwhelming. Not because you are wrong for wanting connection, but because their system interprets emotional dependence differently. For many avoidants, dependence feels risky, even dangerous, because somewhere deep inside, reliance became associated with disappointment. So when closeness deepens, fear quietly enters the room: fear of obligation, fear of emotional pressure, fear of being needed more than they know how to handle, fear of losing independence, fear of becoming responsible for emotions they do not know how to regulate. And that fear can create a painful contradiction, because the avoidant may genuinely care deeply, while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the connection. This is why autonomy matters so much to them. And here is where people often misunderstand autonomy completely. Autonomy does not mean they want distance forever. It does not mean they want to live emotionally disconnected. It does not mean healthy love is impossible. It means they need to feel that closeness does not erase them, that intimacy does not mean imprisonment, that love does not require sacrificing their identity. For an avoidant, healthy love often sounds like You are free to be yourself here. You do not have to disappear to feel safe. You can need space without losing connection. And if they begin feeling that safety consistently, something interesting happens. The walls begin lowering, not dramatically, quietly, one small moment at a time. This is something people often miss. Avoidance rarely transform through grand emotional breakthroughs. Most growth happens in inches, tiny experiences repeated over time. A difficult conversation that does not end in chaos. Space that is respected without emotional punishment. A vulnerable moment met with calm instead of criticism. Small proof. Repeated. Again and again and again. That is how trust slowly enters their nervous system. Because avoidants do not usually trust words first. They trust emotional experience. What consistently happens when they are vulnerable? What consistently happens when they disappoint someone? What consistently happens when they need distance? Do they lose connection? Get criticized? Feel trapped? Or do they experience emotional steadiness? This is why consistency matters so much. And no, not consistency in the perfection sense. Consistency in the emotional sense. Predictability, reliability, clear communication, no emotional games, no constant unpredictability, no emotional whiplash. Because avoidants tend to struggle deeply with uncertainty in relationships, even though many people assume the opposite. Remember, these are people whose early emotional experiences often felt unpredictable already, which means inconsistency does not feel exciting. It feels unsafe. And here is where relationships often start breaking without either person fully understanding why. One person expects mind reading. The avoidant expects directness. One person hints. The avoidant misses it. One person quietly feels hurt. The avoidant feels confused. One person assumes, if they loved me, they would know. The avoidant thinks, why didn't you just tell me? And slowly, misunderstanding begins replacing intimacy. This is why direct communication feels surprisingly important to avoidants. Far more important than many realize. Because avoidants often operate from an internal belief that everyone is responsible for their own emotional needs. Not because they are selfish, but because emotionally, that is how they survived. As children, many learned, no one is coming. Figure it out yourself. So by adulthood, directness feels relieving. Clarity feels calming. Honesty feels safe. Instead of emotional guessing games, they often respond better to straightforward communication. Not, you should already know what I need. But, this hurt me. I need reassurance. I would like more consistency. Can we talk about this? Because underneath the avoidance, many are actually highly sensitive people. Sensitive to conflict, sensitive to criticism, sensitive to emotional overwhelm, sensitive to disappointment. They just hide it differently. And this is the part people rarely understand. Avoidants are often deeply impacted emotionally, even when they appear unaffected externally, sometimes more than they know how to admit. Which brings us to something that quietly wounds avoidance more deeply than almost anything else. Criticism, especially shame, especially rejection disguised as disappointment. And this part matters more than people realize. Because beneath many avoidant defenses, there is often something fragile hiding. A quiet belief. Something may be wrong with me. Not always conscious. Not always visible. But present. Because when emotional needs go unmet repeatedly in childhood, children rarely conclude, my caregivers struggled emotionally. Instead, they internalize, maybe I am too much. Maybe I am defective. Maybe I should need less. And that hidden wound often follows them into adulthood, quietly, silently. invisible from the outside, but deeply active underneath, which is why criticism can hit avoidance harder than people realize. Even small criticism, even neutral feedback, sometimes what sounds like concern to you, feels like emotional rejection to them, not because they are irrational, but because their nervous system hears old pain. And over time, too much criticism can slowly shut them down emotionally, not because they stopped caring, but because closeness starts feeling emotionally unsafe again. This does not mean you should walk on eggshells. It does not mean unhealthy behavior should be excused. It does not mean you abandon your needs to protect theirs. No, healthy love still requires honesty, boundaries, accountability, truth. But the way truth is delivered matters, especially with someone whose nervous system already expects rejection. Because there is a difference between, "You always fail me," and "This hurt me, and I want us to work through it." One creates shame, the other creates repair. And for avoidance, repair matters more than people think. Because beneath the distance, many are not actually afraid of love. They are afraid that closeness will eventually become pain. Again, and once you begin understanding this emotional world, something important changes. You stop asking only, "Why are they pulling away?" and start asking something deeper. What actually helps an avoidant feel safe enough to stay? Because the answer is not pressure, not emotional chasing, not abandoning yourself, not becoming endlessly patient while your own needs disappear. The answer is something much more balanced, much more mature, much more difficult. A kind of love where closeness and freedom stop feeling like enemies. And that is where things begin changing. There comes a moment in many relationships with avoidance where both people quietly begin hurting, and neither fully understands why. At first, the connection may have felt unusually deep, even calming. There may have been chemistry, long conversations, unexpected vulnerability, moments where the avoidant opened just enough for you to think, "This is real. They trust me. We are building something meaningful." And maybe you were. That is what makes what comes next feel so confusing. Because slowly, almost invisibly, the relationship begins changing shape. Not through one dramatic explosion, not through one obvious betrayal, but through accumulation, small misunderstandings, missed emotional moments, unspoken expectations, distance that slowly becomes harder to explain. And if no one understands what is happening beneath the surface, the bond quietly begins turning against itself. This is where most avoidant relationships begin breaking. Not because love is absent, but because fear quietly becomes louder than connection. And perhaps the hardest truth to understand is this: what hurts the relationship is often not the problem itself. It is how the nervous systems of both people respond to the problem. Because relationships with avoidance often create a painful emotional dance. One person begins reaching, the other begins retreating. One person seeks reassurance, the other seeks regulation. One person fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. And both people end up accidentally triggering the very wounds they are trying to avoid. You see it happen slowly. The avoidance starts pulling back. Maybe their energy changes. Maybe they seem distracted, harder to read, less emotionally available. And naturally, you react. Most people would. You ask questions. You seek clarity. You want reassurance. You want to understand what changed. Because confusion hurts. Distance hurts. Silence hurts. Especially when someone who once felt emotionally present suddenly feels far away. But this is where things often become complicated. Because what feels like healthy closeness to one person can feel emotionally overwhelming to an avoidant nervous system. Not because your needs are wrong, not because love is wrong, but because pressure and intimacy often become emotionally tangled together for them. This matters a lot because many avoidants are carrying invisible fears they rarely know how to articulate. Fears like, what if I disappoint them? What if I lose myself? What if I cannot meet their needs? What if closeness becomes obligation? What if I fail inside this relationship? And when those fears activate, withdrawal becomes regulation. Distance becomes emotional oxygen. Space becomes survival. But here is where the cycle turns painful. Because while the avoidant is trying to calm overwhelm, their partner often interprets distance as rejection. And rejection creates panic. The questions get bigger. The emotional intensity increases. The reassurance becomes more urgent. The emotional pursuit grows stronger. Not because anyone is manipulative, not because anyone is broken, because pain is happening, and pain wants relief. But here is the tragedy of this dynamic. The very thing one person needs to feel safe often triggers fear in the other. The closer one moves, the farther the other pulls, and eventually, both people feel unseen. The partner thinks, why are they shutting me out? The avoidant thinks, why can't I breathe? And neither person realizes they are often responding to old wounds more than present reality. This is why criticism becomes especially dangerous in avoidant relationships. Because underneath many avoidant defenses, there is often an old emotional bruise few people ever see. A fear of being fundamentally flawed, not always consciously, but quietly, persistently. Many avoidants carry hidden shame they rarely talk about. Shame around needing people, shame around emotions, shame around vulnerability, shame around not knowing how to do intimacy well. And when criticism enters the relationship, even small criticism, it can land much heavier than expected. You say, why are you being distant? They hear, you are failing me. You say, I need more from you. They hear, you are not enough. You say, why can't you just communicate? They hear, there is something wrong with you. Again, not because your feelings are invalid, but because their nervous system is interpreting the moment through old emotional pain. And over time, repeated criticism can quietly harden avoidance. Because if closeness starts feeling emotionally unsafe, withdrawal starts feeling safer again. This is why many avoidants begin shutting down in relationships that become emotionally volatile. Not because they stopped loving, but because they stopped feeling emotionally safe. And here is where another misunderstanding quietly destroys connection. Mind reading expectations. This one is huge because many partners unknowingly assume if they love me, they should know what I need. But avoidants often struggle with implied emotional communication, not because they do not care, because clarity feels safer to them than emotional guessing. Remember, many avoidants learned early that emotional needs were not reliably met, so they became deeply self-reliant, emotionally practical, hyper-independent, and because of that, they often assume everyone else is also responsible for communicating their needs directly. So when needs go unspoken, tension grows. One person waits to be understood. The avoidant stays confused. One person silently hurts. The avoidant feels blindsided. One person thinks, they should know. The avoidant thinks, why didn't you just tell me? And slowly, resentment starts replacing connection. This is where so many relationships quietly begin collapsing. Not because love disappeared, but because communication became distorted by assumptions. And there is another painful truth many people do not want to hear. You cannot love an avoidant into healing. You cannot rescue them into readiness. You cannot overgive your way into emotional security. This is where many deeply caring people lose themselves because they think, if I just love harder, if I become more patient, if I explain better, if I stop asking for my needs, maybe then they will feel safe enough to stay. But eventually, exhaustion enters the relationship because love without reciprocity becomes depletion. Empathy without boundaries becomes resentment. Understanding without accountability becomes self-abandonment. And this matters deeply because healthy love with an avoidant does not mean tolerating emotional starvation. It does not mean endlessly excusing shutdowns. It does not mean accepting inconsistency as proof of depth. And this is important to hear, especially if you love deeply, because compassion without standards eventually becomes pain. You are allowed to understand someone's wounds without making those wounds your responsibility to carry. You are allowed to have empathy without sacrificing emotional safety. You are allowed to love someone without abandoning yourself. This is where relationships either begin growing or quietly breaking, because eventually something has to change. Either the avoidant begins becoming more emotionally aware, or the cycle deepens, and growth rarely arrives dramatically. Usually, it begins quietly. The avoidant starts noticing their patterns, starts recognizing shutdowns, starts learning that space does not have to mean disappearance, starts understanding that vulnerability is uncomfortable but survivable, starts learning that emotional honesty does not automatically create danger. And at the same time, the other partner grows too. They stop chasing panic, stop making every moment of distance mean catastrophe, stop collapsing into fear every time uncertainty appears. They become more grounded, more emotionally regulated, more honest about what they need, less reactive, more rooted. And something important begins happening. The relationship stops feeling like survival and starts feeling more like partnership. But this shift only happens when both people are growing. That part matters because one-sided emotional labor cannot sustain healthy love. One person cannot do all the healing. One person cannot carry all the awareness. One person cannot endlessly hold the emotional weight for two. At some point, the avoidant must begin choosing growth too. Not perfection, not overnight transformation. Growth, effort, self-awareness, accountability, a willingness to stay emotionally present even when fear appears. Because fear will appear. That part is normal. The question is, what happens next? Do they disappear, defend, withdraw, avoid, or do they begin learning how to stay, even imperfectly, even slowly, even awkwardly? Because this is the difference between an avoidant relationship that slowly becomes healthier and one that quietly drains both people. And there is something else people rarely talk about. Some relationships with avoidance are not meant to survive, not because anyone failed, but because sometimes love reveals incompatibility. Sometimes one person wants growth, the other wants emotional escape. Sometimes one person becomes more secure, the other stays emotionally unavailable. Sometimes the lesson is not stay longer. Sometimes the lesson is love yourself enough to stop shrinking. That truth hurts, but it matters because intensity alone does not mean compatibility. Chemistry alone does not mean safety. Longing alone does not mean love is growing. Watch the direction, not only the emotion. Watch the pattern, not only the potential. Watch what changes. Because if fear keeps winning every chapter, eventually love becomes exhaustion. But if growth slowly begins replacing fear, something different starts happening. Something quieter, something stronger. The relationship stops revolving around survival and begins learning something neither person fully trusted before, that closeness and freedom can actually exist together. And this is where the story becomes honest. Because by now, you may be asking yourself a question that sits quietly beneath everything we have explored. Can this actually work? Can an avoidant truly build healthy love? Can closeness survive the fear? Can a relationship stop feeling like emotional whiplash and finally become something steady? The answer is not simple, but it is real. Yes, it can work, but only when both people stop trying to survive the relationship and start learning how to build one. That distinction changes everything. Because what makes relationships with avoidance difficult is not the attachment style itself. It is unconsciousness. It is when fear stays hidden, needs stay unspoken, patterns stay unexamined, and pain keeps repeating without understanding. That is when relationships slowly collapse beneath emotional confusion. But when awareness enters the picture, something begins changing. Not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. The avoidant begins recognizing that distance is not always protection. Sometimes it is sabotage. They begin seeing that shutting down may create temporary relief, but long term loneliness. They start understanding that intimacy is uncomfortable not because it is wrong, but because it activates old survival strategies they never questioned before. And this realization matters because awareness creates choice. Before awareness, withdrawal feels automatic. Defensiveness feels automatic. Not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. The avoidant begins recognizing that distance is not always protection. Sometimes it is sabotage. They begin seeing that shutting down may create temporary relief, but long term loneliness. They start understanding that intimacy is uncomfortable not because it is wrong, but because it activates old survival strategies they never questioned before. And this realization matters because awareness creates choice. Before awareness, withdrawal feels automatic. Defensiveness feels automatic. Disappearing feels automatic. But after awareness, something small begins happening. A pause, a moment of reflection. A new question appears. What if I stayed instead of running? What if I communicated instead of shutting down? What if closeness is not the danger I thought it was? That moment, small as it seems, can quietly change an entire relationship. But growth does not only belong to the avoidant. This part matters too, because if you love someone avoidant, you are changing as well, or at least you are being invited to, not into self abandonment, not into emotional silence, not into becoming endlessly understanding while your own needs disappear. No, into something deeper, into emotional steadiness, into self respect, into learning how to love someone without losing yourself in the process. And for many people, this becomes the real transformation. Because relationships with avoidance often expose wounds you did not even know were running your life. Fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, fear of being left, fear of emotional inconsistency, fear of uncertainty. And suddenly, the relationship becomes more than romance. It becomes a mirror, one that asks difficult questions. Questions like, can you stay grounded when someone pulls away? Can you communicate clearly instead of mind reading? Can you love deeply without overfunctioning? Can you stop turning someone else's emotional availability into proof of your worth? These are not easy questions, but they matter because healthy relationships are not built through chemistry alone. They are built through emotional responsibility. And eventually, something important becomes clear. The strongest avoidant relationships are not the ones without fear. They are the ones where fear stops making every decision. That difference is everything. Because fear may still appear. There may still be moments of withdrawal, moments of overwhelm, moments where old patterns try to return. But now, the relationship handles them differently. The avoidance says, I need space, but I'm not leaving. Instead of disappearing, the partner says, I feel hurt, but I'm not panicking. Instead of chasing, conversations become clearer, repair becomes faster, misunderstandings become less destructive, and slowly, the relationship starts feeling safer for both people. Not perfect, safe. And safe love is often quieter than fantasy, less dramatic, less intoxicating, but infinitely more sustainable. Because mature love does not ask, how intensely do we feel? It asks, how well do we repair? How honestly do we communicate? How safely can we stay close when fear appears? That is where real intimacy begins. Not in chemistry, not in obsession, not in emotional highs, but in repeated emotional safety. Over time, repeated enough that the nervous system begins trusting what it once feared. And if that growth is happening, you will feel it. The distance becomes softer. The closeness becomes steadier. The confusion becomes quieter. You stop feeling like you are constantly decoding silence. They stop feeling like closeness is emotional pressure. The relationship starts breathing, not suffocating, not collapsing, breathing. And here is the truth many people need to hear. Not every avoidant relationship is meant to last. Sometimes love reveals timing issues. Sometimes emotional readiness is missing. Sometimes growth is one-sided. Sometimes the healthiest thing is letting go. And that truth deserves honesty. Because staying in pain, hoping someone eventually changes, is not love. It is emotional gambling. Potential is not commitment. Chemistry is not compatibility. And understanding someone's wounds does not mean sacrificing your own well-being. So if you are loving someone avoidant right now, ask yourself something honest. Not, do I love them? You probably do. Ask, are we both growing? Are we both becoming more emotionally responsible? Is this relationship teaching us security or repeating fear? Because that answer tells the truth, not the intensity, not the longing, not the mixed signals, the direction, always the direction. And maybe that is the deepest lesson inside all of this. Healthy love is not built by forcing closeness, and it is not built by avoiding it either. It is built when two imperfect people slowly learn how to stop letting old pain speak louder than present connection. When freedom no longer feels threatened by intimacy. When closeness no longer feels like emotional danger. When honesty becomes safer than silence. And if that is happening, even slowly, do not underestimate it. Because real change rarely looks dramatic. Usually, it looks like two people becoming a little braver than they were yesterday, a little softer, a little more honest, a little more willing to stay. And if this message connected with something deep inside you, take a moment to reflect honestly on your own relationships, not just who someone else is becoming, but who you are becoming inside the connection. Because the healthiest love will never ask you to disappear. And the strongest relationships are not built through perfection. They are built through awareness, through growth, through emotional courage. So if this gave you clarity, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who may need to hear this today. And remember, sometimes the deepest healing does not happen when love feels easy. Sometimes it happens when two people finally stop fighting closeness and start learning how to trust it.